It was August 6, 2005, when one of the most daring heists in Brazilian history unfolded, as thieves tunneled their way into the vault of the Banco Central branch in Fortaleza, making off with approximately $160 million. This brazen burglary, which would become known as the Banco Central burglary at Fortaleza, was a complex operation that left authorities stunned and the public fascinated. At its core, the heist was a meticulously planned and executed crime that exploited the very foundations of the bank's security. But what drove these individuals to conceive and carry out such a bold plan, and how did they manage to evade capture for so long? As investigators delved deeper into the case, they discovered that the heist was the result of months of planning and preparation by a group of skilled criminals. The gang, which included individuals with expertise in engineering, security, and other relevant fields, had assembled in the months leading up to the heist. They worked tirelessly to dig a tunnel from a nearby house to the bank's vault, avoiding detection by using a fake artificial turf company as a front for their operations. But that wasn't the strangest part. The group had also managed to gather vital security information from a mole within the bank, which they used to plan their every move. This level of sophistication and inside knowledge raises questions about the extent of the gang's connections and how they were able to gather such sensitive information. The investigation, led by the Brazilian Federal Police, was a painstaking process that involved following a trail of clues and gathering evidence from the crime scene. As they dug deeper, they began to piece together the events of that fateful night, revealing a complex web of characters and motives. The gang's leader, Luis Fernando Ribeiro, was a mastermind who had carefully planned every aspect of the heist. But his eventual murder, allegedly at the hands of kidnappers, adds another layer of complexity to the story. The fact that several gang members were also victims of kidnapping and that a significant portion of the stolen money was never recovered suggests that there may be more to the story than initially meets the eye. As the authorities worked to apprehend the perpetrators and recover the stolen funds, they encountered numerous challenges and setbacks. The gang had planned their escape carefully, leaving behind a trail of false leads and decoys to throw the police off their scent. But the Brazilian Federal Police persevered, using their skills and resources to track down the gang members and bring them to justice. In the end, 129 arrests were made, and $32 million was recovered, a significant portion of the stolen money. However, the fact that many of the gang members were able to evade capture for so long, and that some were even murdered or kidnapped, raises questions about the level of corruption and organized crime involved in the heist. The Banco Central burglary at Fortaleza is often compared to other notable bank heists, such as the Knightsbridge security deposit robbery in London, which occurred in 1987. That heist, led by the infamous Valerio Vixi, was notable for its brazen nature and the fact that it was carried out with inside help. Similarly, the Banco Central burglary at Fortaleza was a highly sophisticated operation that relied on careful planning and execution. But what sets these heists apart from others is the level of complexity and the sheer amount of money involved. The Banco Central burglary at Fortaleza is considered one of the largest bank robberies in history, and its impact on the Brazilian economy was significant. The aftermath of the heist saw a significant increase in security measures at banks across Brazil, as well as a renewed focus on combating organized crime. The Brazilian Federal Police also implemented new strategies and techniques for investigating and preventing bank heists, which have since been used to prevent other similar crimes. But the legacy of the Banco Central burglary at Fortaleza extends beyond the world of crime and law enforcement. The heist has also inspired numerous books, films, and documentaries, including the 2011 Brazilian thriller film Assalto ao Banco Central, which dramatizes the events of the heist. As we continue to explore the intricacies of this daring heist, we are reminded that the truth is often more complex and fascinating than fiction. But that's a story for another time, as we delve deeper into the world of high-stakes crime and the authorities who pursue them. The Banco Central burglary at Fortaleza was a heist that shook the very foundations of Brazil's economy, and as we delve deeper, it becomes clear that the masterminds behind it were not just ordinary thieves. They were calculated, meticulous, and had a deep understanding of the bank's security systems. The gang, led by Luis Fernando Ribeiro, spent months digging a tunnel from a rented house to the bank's vault, avoiding detection by the authorities. But what's even more intriguing is that they had inside help, with some members of the gang having previously worked in the construction industry, giving them the expertise to navigate the tunnel's complex architecture. But that wasn't the only factor that contributed to their success. The gang also had a sophisticated understanding of the bank's security protocols, which allowed them to bypass alarms and cameras. This level of sophistication raises questions about the potential involvement of insiders or former employees who may have provided the gang with crucial information. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that the gang had indeed received vital security information from a mysterious source, which they used to plan their moves once inside the vault. But the identity of this source remains a mystery, leaving investigators to wonder if there were more people involved than initially thought. As the gang finally reached the vault on August 6, 2005, after 3 months of digging, they made off with approximately $160 million. But the heist was not without its complications. The gang's plan was to divide the money equally among its members, but tensions arose when some members felt they were not receiving a fair share. This led to a dramatic turn of events, with one member, Salo, being shot dead by the gang's leader, Barrow. The incident highlights the high stakes and brutal nature of the heist, where loyalty and trust were constantly being tested. But what's even more surprising is that the gang's plan to divide the money was not as straightforward as it seemed, with some members receiving significantly more than others. The aftermath of the heist saw a massive manhunt, with the Brazilian federal police working tirelessly to track down the gang members and recover the stolen money. But the gang had planned their escape carefully, using a series of safe houses and fake companies to cover their tracks. They even planted a large sum of money in a car, which was then loaded onto an auto rack headed for Sao Paulo in an attempt to throw the police off their trail. The move was a clever distraction, but it ultimately led to the arrest of one of the gang members, who was caught with a significant amount of cash. But that wasn't the strangest part. The gang's use of a fake artificial turf company as a front for their operations was a clever ruse. But it also raises questions about how they managed to set up such a complex operation without arousing suspicion. As the investigation continued, it became clear that the Banco Central burglary at Fortaleza was not an isolated incident. It was part of a larger trend of high-stakes heists that had been taking place around the world. The Knightsbridge security deposit robbery, which took place in London in 1987, was another notable example of a daring heist that had shaken the banking industry. The robbery, led by Valerio Vixi, had netted the thieves an estimated £60 million, and it had been carried out with similar precision and planning as the Banco Central burglary. But what's even more fascinating is that the two heists share some striking similarities, with both involving sophisticated planning, inside help, and a deep understanding of the security systems in place. The comparison between the two heists raises important questions about the nature of high-stakes crime and the measures that can be taken to prevent it. As we continue to explore the intricacies of the Banco Central burglary, it becomes clear that the heist was not just a simple robbery, but a complex operation that involved careful planning, sophisticated techniques, and a deep understanding of the banking system. But what's even more surprising is that the heist also highlights the vulnerabilities of the banking system and the need for more effective security measures to be put in place to prevent such crimes from happening in the future. As we delve deeper into the world of high-stakes crime, it becomes clear that the Banco Central burglary at Fortaleza is just the tip of the iceberg, and that there are many more secrets waiting to be uncovered. But that's a story for another time, as we continue to follow the trail of clues and uncover the truth behind this daring heist. The Banco Central burglary at Fortaleza, as we've seen, was a complex and brazen heist that shook the Brazilian economy to its core. But what's equally fascinating is how this crime has been immortalized in popular culture, most notably in the 2011 Brazilian thriller film, Federal Bank Heist. This movie, directed by Marcos Paulo Simões, takes creative liberties with the true story, but it does capture the essence of the planning and execution that went into the real-life heist. The film's portrayal of the tunnel digging, the assembly of the criminal team, and the eventual betrayal and violence that ensued all serve as a testament to the daring nature of this crime. But that wasn't the strangest part. As we delve deeper into the story, we find that the real-life mastermind behind the heist, Luis Fernando Ribeiro, met a tragic end, being killed by kidnappers after a ransom was paid. This turn of events raises more questions than answers, and we're left wondering what really happened in the aftermath of the heist. The fact that several gang members were thought to have been victims of kidnapping, and that only a fraction of the stolen money was recovered, suggests that there's still much we don't know about this case. The investigation into the Banco Central burglary at Fortaleza was led by the Brazilian Federal Police, who worked tirelessly to track down the perpetrators and recover the stolen funds. Their efforts ultimately led to the arrest of 129 individuals and the recovery of 32 million reais, a significant portion of the stolen money. But what's remarkable is how this investigation also prevented other burglaries, as revealed in the Netflix documentary 3 Tonelada, Assalto ao Banco Central. This documentary sheds light on the meticulous planning and execution that went into the heist, and how the authorities were able to stay one step ahead of the criminals. As we examine the Banco Central burglary at Fortaleza, it's hard not to draw comparisons with other notable bank robberies throughout history. The Knightsbridge security deposit robbery, which took place in London in 1987, is a prime example. This daring heist, led by Valerio Vixi, resulted in the theft of an estimated £60 million, making it one of the largest bank robberies in history. The similarities between these two crimes are striking, from the use of inside help to the brazen nature of the heist itself. But what's equally fascinating is how the investigations into these crimes were conducted, and how the authorities were able to track down the perpetrators. The story of Valerio Vixi, the mastermind behind the Knightsbridge security deposit robbery, is a captivating one. A lawyer's son with a penchant for armed robbery, Vixi's exploits in London were the stuff of legend. His ability to secure inside help, in the form of the managing director of the center, Parvez Latif, was a key factor in the success of the heist. But Vixi's eventual downfall, after being arrested and sentenced to 22 years in prison, serves as a reminder that even the most daring criminals can ultimately be brought to justice. The fact that he was able to forge a friendship with the officer who led his arrest, Dick Leach, is a testament to the complex and often surprising nature of these crimes. As we continue to explore the world of high-stakes crime, it becomes clear that the Banco Central burglary at Fortaleza is just one part of a larger narrative. The fact that this heist, along with the Knightsbridge security deposit robbery and the $900 million stolen from the Central Bank of Iraq in 2003, are considered among the largest bank robberies in history, raises important questions about the nature of crime and the measures that can be taken to prevent it. But that's a story for another time, as we continue to follow the trail of clues and uncover the truth behind these daring heists. The complexity and brazen nature of these crimes are a reminder that, even in the world of high-stakes crime, nothing is ever as it seems, and that the truth is often far more surprising than fiction. The Brazilian Federal Police's investigation into the Banco Central burglary at Fortaleza is a prime example of the complexities and challenges that arise in these types of cases. The fact that they were able to recover a significant portion of the stolen funds and prevent other burglaries is a testament to their dedication and expertise. But what's equally impressive is how they were able to piece together the events surrounding the heist, from the initial planning to the eventual betrayal and violence that ensued. The investigation is a fascinating case study in the art of detection, and serves as a reminder that, even in the most complex and brazen crimes, justice can ultimately be served. As we delve deeper into the world of high-stakes crime, it becomes clear that the Banco Central burglary at Fortaleza is just the tip of the iceberg. The fact that this heist, along with others like the Knightsbridge security deposit robbery, are considered among the largest bank robberies in history, raises important questions about the nature of crime and the measures that can be taken to prevent it. The complexity and brazen nature of these crimes are a reminder that, even in the world of high-stakes crime, nothing is ever as it seems, and that the truth is often far more surprising than fiction. But what's equally fascinating is how these crimes have been immortalized in popular culture, from the 2011 film Federal Bank, Heist, to the numerous documentaries and books that have been written about these crimes. The story of the Banco Central burglary at Fortaleza is a complex and fascinating one, full of twists and turns that continue to captivate audiences to this day. The fact that this heist, along with others like the Knightsbridge security deposit robbery, are considered among the largest bank robberies in history, raises important questions about the nature of crime and the measures that can be taken to prevent it. But what's equally impressive is how the authorities were able to track down the perpetrators and recover a significant portion of the stolen funds. The investigation into this crime is a fascinating case study in the art of detection and serves as a reminder that, even in the most complex and brazen crimes, justice can ultimately be served. But that's not the end of the story, as we continue to follow the trail of clues and uncover the truth behind this daring heist. As the investigation into the Banco Central burglary at Fort Ailsa continued, it became clear that the heist was not just a simple crime of opportunity, but a complex and carefully planned operation. The thieves had spent months digging a tunnel from a nearby house to the bank's vault, using sophisticated engineering techniques to avoid detection. But what's even more remarkable is that they were able to assemble a team of experts, including a civil engineer and a former police officer, to help them carry out the heist. The question on everyone's mind was, how did they manage to recruit such a diverse and skilled group of individuals? The answer lies in the charismatic leadership of the mastermind behind the operation, Luis Fernando Ribeiro. Ribeiro was a high-ranking criminal with a reputation for pulling off daring heists, and he was able to attract a loyal following of individuals who were drawn to his vision and his promise of a big payday. But as the investigation would later reveal, Ribeiro's leadership was not without its challenges. There were rumors of infighting and power struggles within the group, and it's clear that not everyone was happy with the way the operation was being run. But that wasn't the strangest part. It was the way the group was able to use their skills and expertise to stay one step ahead of the law. The Brazilian federal police were facing a daunting task in tracking down the thieves and recovering the stolen money. The investigation was led by Sheriff Amorim, a seasoned and determined lawman who was determined to solve the case. Amorim and his team worked tirelessly to follow the trail of clues, from the tunnel to the bank's vault, to the fake company that the thieves had set up as a front. But as they delved deeper into the case, they began to realize that the heist was just the tip of the iceberg. There were hints of a larger conspiracy involving corrupt officials and organized crime syndicates. It was clear that the Banco Central burglary was not just a simple bank heist, but a symptom of a much larger problem. As the investigation continued, the police began to make some breakthroughs. They arrested several members of the gang, including the former police officer who had helped to plan the heist. But despite these successes, the mastermind behind the operation remained at large. Ribeiro had gone into hiding, and the police were struggling to track him down. It was a cat-and-mouse game, with the police following every lead, every tip, every hint that might bring them closer to their quarry. But Ribeiro was a cunning and elusive foe, and it seemed that he was always one step ahead of the law. That was until the police received a tip that would change the course of the investigation forever. The tip came from an unexpected source, a former member of the gang who had become disillusioned with the operation. The informant told the police that Ribeiro was hiding in a safe house on the outskirts of the city, and that he was planning to make a move to escape the country. The police acted quickly, surrounding the safe house and preparing to make an arrest. But as they closed in on Ribeiro, they realized that something was off. The house was empty, and there was no sign of Ribeiro or any of his accomplices. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. But that wasn't the strangest part. It was what happened next that would shake the very foundations of the investigation. In a stunning twist, the police discovered that Ribeiro had been kidnapped by a rival gang who were demanding a ransom in exchange for his safe release. The police were faced with a difficult decision: should they pay the ransom and risk setting a dangerous precedent? Or should they try to rescue Ribeiro and risk putting his life in danger? It was a classic dilemma, and one that would have far-reaching consequences for the investigation. As the police deliberated, they couldn't help but wonder what other secrets was Ribeiro hiding, and what would happen if he fell into the wrong hands. The answer to that question would have to wait, as the investigation took a dramatic turn that would change everything. The kidnapping of Ribeiro was a pivotal moment in the investigation, and it marked a turning point in the case. The police were forced to reevaluate their priorities and to consider the possibility that Ribeiro was not the only target. As they delved deeper into the case, they began to uncover a web of corruption and deceit that went all the way to the top. It was a complex and sinister plot, involving corrupt officials, organized crime syndicates, and even international terrorists. The Banco Central burglary was just the tip of the iceberg, and the police were about to uncover a conspiracy that would shake the very foundations of the Brazilian economy. But as they got closer to the truth, they realized that they were in grave danger. The stakes were high, and the consequences of failure were dire. The police were in a race against time to uncover the truth and bring the perpetrators to justice. But as they worked tirelessly to follow the trail of clues, they couldn't help but wonder what other secrets were waiting to be uncovered, and what would happen if they got too close to the truth. The moment investigators set foot inside the fake synthetic turf store, the scale of the operation began to crystallize. Beneath floorboards and reinforced concrete lay a tunnel that defied everything law enforcement understood about traditional bank burglaries. It was engineered with precision, lined with wood, fitted with electric lights, and equipped with air conditioning. Yet, as forensic teams combed through the dirt and debris, they began to unravel the magnitude of the operation, a heist that would go down in history as one of the most daring bank burglaries of all time. The tunnel, meticulously engineered and constructed, was a marvel in itself, a testament to the ingenuity and precision of the perpetrators. But what was even more astonishing was the fact that the gang had managed to evade detection for so long, despite the presence of multiple security cameras and alarms in the area. It was as if they had inside help, or, at the very least, a deep understanding of the bank's security systems. But that wasn't the strangest part. As investigators delved deeper into the case, they discovered that the gang had been planning the heist for months, maybe even years. They had assembled a team of experts, each with their own unique skill set, from engineering to security. It was a well-oiled machine, with each member playing a crucial role in the operation. And at the helm of it all was Luis Fernando Ribeiro, the mastermind behind the heist. But what drove him to plan such a daring robbery? Was it greed, or was there something more to it? As the investigation continued, more questions arose. How did the gang manage to dig a tunnel without being detected? Did they have help from within the bank, or did they use advanced technology to evade detection? And what happened to the money? Was it laundered, or was it hidden away in secret accounts? The more investigators dug, the more complex the case became. It was a web of intrigue, with each thread leading to more questions and more suspects. The Brazilian federal police were determined to get to the bottom of the case, and they worked tirelessly to track down the perpetrators. They followed a trail of clues, from the fake synthetic turf store to the abandoned houses and safe houses used by the gang. And slowly but surely, they began to make arrests. But for every arrest made, more questions arose. Who was the real mastermind behind the heist? Was it Luis Fernando Ribeiro, or was there someone else pulling the strings? As the case unfolded, it became clear that the Banco Central burglary was not an isolated incident. It was part of a larger trend of daring heists that had taken place around the world. The Knightsbridge security deposit robbery in London, the $900 million stolen from the Central Bank of Iraq, and the Banco Central burglary all shared a common thread. They were all meticulously planned and executed, with a level of precision and sophistication that was unprecedented. It was as if a new breed of thief had emerged, one that was more cunning and more ruthless than ever before. But what was even more alarming was the fact that these heists were not just about the money. They were about the statement they made, the bold declaration that the thieves could outsmart and outmaneuver even the most sophisticated security systems. It was a challenge to the authorities, a taunt that they could not be caught. And it was a wake-up call, a reminder that the world of crime was evolving, and that the rules of the game were changing. As the investigation into the Banco Central burglary continued, the Brazilian federal police found themselves in a game of cat and mouse with the perpetrators. They were determined to bring the thieves to justice, but the thieves were equally determined to evade capture. It was a battle of wits, with each side trying to outmaneuver the other. And in the end, it was a battle that would have far-reaching consequences, not just for the perpetrators, but for the entire banking system. The question was, who would emerge victorious, the thieves or the law? Only time would tell. As the investigation into the Banco Central burglary at Fortaleza continued, it became clear that the thieves had left behind a trail of clues, but also a web of deceit and misdirection. The Brazilian federal police were determined to catch the perpetrators, but the gang's clever planning and execution had given them a significant head start. The police were faced with a daunting task, trying to piece together the events of the heist and track down the individuals involved. But that wasn't the strangest part. The more they dug, the more they realized that this heist was not just about stealing money, but about the intricacies of human relationships and the blurred lines between right and wrong. The mastermind behind the heist, Luis Fernando Ribeiro, had been killed by kidnappers after a ransom was paid, leaving behind a power vacuum and a trail of unanswered questions. The police were still trying to understand the dynamics of the group and how they had managed to pull off such a daring heist. As they delved deeper, they discovered that the gang had used a combination of intimidation, manipulation, and clever planning to get what they wanted. But what drove these individuals to take such risks, and what were the consequences of their actions? The police were determined to find out, but the more they learned, the more they realized that nothing was as it seemed. The investigation had also shed light on the broader implications of the heist, highlighting the vulnerabilities of the banking system and the need for increased security measures. The Brazilian government was under pressure to take action, and the police were working tirelessly to prevent similar heists from happening in the future. But as they worked to strengthen the system, they couldn't help but wonder what other secrets lay hidden, waiting to be uncovered. The Banco Central burglary at Fortaleza had exposed a weakness in the system, but it had also raised questions about the nature of crime and punishment in Brazil. As the police continued their pursuit of the perpetrators, they began to notice a pattern of similarities between this heist and others that had taken place around the world. The Knightsbridge security deposit robbery, which had occurred in 1987, had also involved a cleverly planned tunnel and a group of skilled thieves. The parallels between the two heists were striking, and the police couldn't help but wonder if there was a connection between the two. But what could they learn from these similarities, and how could they use this knowledge to prevent future heists? The investigation was taking a new turn, one that would lead them down a rabbit hole of twists and turns. The more the police learned about the Banco Central burglary, the more they realized that it was just one piece of a larger puzzle. The heist had been carried out with precision and skill, but it had also left behind a trail of destruction and chaos. The police were determined to bring the perpetrators to justice, but they knew that it wouldn't be easy. The gang had planned the heist carefully, using their skills and resources to evade capture. But the police were equally determined, and they were willing to do whatever it took to solve the case. As they worked to unravel the mystery, they couldn't help but wonder what would happen next, and how would the story of the Banco Central burglary at Fortaleza finally come to an end. The Brazilian federal police had made significant progress in the investigation, with 129 arrests and 32 million reais recovered. But despite these successes, the case was far from closed. The police were still searching for the remaining perpetrators, and they were working to recover the rest of the stolen money. The investigation had been a long and difficult one, but the police were determined to see it through to the end. As they worked to bring the perpetrators to justice, they couldn't help but think about the broader implications of the heist. What did it say about the state of the banking system, and what did it reveal about the nature of crime and punishment in Brazil? The answers to these questions would have to wait, but one thing was certain: the Banco Central burglary at Fortaleza would go down in history as one of the most daring heists of all time. The story of the Banco Central burglary at Fortaleza was a complex one, full of twists and turns. The police had worked tirelessly to solve the case, but they had also been forced to confront the darker aspects of human nature. The heist had been carried out with precision and skill, but it had also left behind a trail of destruction and chaos. As the police worked to bring the perpetrators to justice, they couldn't help but wonder what would happen next, and how would the story of the Banco Central burglary at Fortaleza finally come to an end. The investigation was ongoing, and the police were still searching for answers. But as they worked to unravel the mystery, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were just scratching the surface of something much bigger, and that the true extent of the heist's consequences was only just beginning to emerge. As the investigation continued, detectives began to notice a peculiar trend among the suspects they were questioning. Many of them had ties to a notorious Brazilian gang, known for their involvement in high-stakes robberies and money laundering schemes. But what really caught the attention of the authorities was the fact that several of these suspects had recently traveled to Paraguay, a country with a reputation for being a hub for illicit activities. This raised more questions than answers, as the police couldn't help but wonder if the Banco Central burglary was just the tip of the iceberg, and if there were more heists like this one being planned in the shadows. The more the police dug, the more they realized that the heist was not just about stealing money, but also about the sophisticated methods used to carry out the crime. The thieves had used advanced tunneling techniques, similar to those used in mining operations, to dig their way into the bank's vault. This level of expertise suggested that the perpetrators had received professional training and possibly even had experience in similar operations. But that wasn't the strangest part. As the investigators looked closer at the evidence, they found that the tunnel itself was not the only impressive aspect of the heist. The thieves had also used advanced ventilation systems to remove dust and debris from the tunnel, allowing them to work for hours without being detected. One of the lead detectives on the case, a seasoned veteran with years of experience in solving high-profile crimes, couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The level of planning and execution was too perfect, too calculated. It was as if the thieves had inside help, or, at the very least, had been able to gather intimate knowledge of the bank's security systems. This led the detective to start investigating the bank's own employees, looking for anyone who might have had a grudge or a motive to be involved in the heist. And then, a surprising revelation emerged. One of the bank's former employees, a man who had been fired just months before the heist, had been in deep financial trouble. He had been struggling to pay his debts and had even been known to associate with some shady characters. As the police brought this former employee in for questioning, they began to piece together a timeline of events that led up to the heist. It turned out that the man had been in contact with some of the suspects and had even provided them with detailed information about the bank's security systems. But here's the thing. The man claimed he had been coerced, that he had been threatened by the gang and had no choice but to cooperate. The police were skeptical, but as they dug deeper, they found evidence that suggested the man might be telling the truth. It seemed that the gang had been using intimidation and violence to get what they wanted, and the former employee had simply been a pawn in their game. The investigation was getting more complicated by the day, with new twists and turns emerging at every corner. The police were working around the clock to follow up on leads, but the more they learned, the more they realized that the Banco Central burglary was just one part of a much larger puzzle. There were rumors of other heists, similar in scope and sophistication, that had taken place in other parts of the country. The police couldn't confirm anything, but the rumors were persistent, and they couldn't help but wonder if they were dealing with a massive, coordinated crime wave. And then, just as they thought things couldn't get any more complicated, they received a cryptic message from an anonymous source, claiming to have information about the heist. The message was vague, but it hinted at a deep-seated corruption within the Brazilian government and suggested that the Banco Central burglary was just a small part of a much larger scheme to embezzle funds and launder money. The police were intrigued, but they were also cautious. They had been down this road before, chasing leads that had turned out to be nothing more than wild goose chases. But something about this message resonated with them. Maybe it was the timing, or the fact that the message seemed to come from someone with intimate knowledge of the heist. Whatever it was, the police decided to pursue the lead and see where it would take them. As they delved deeper into the world of Brazilian politics, they began to uncover a web of corruption and deceit that went all the way to the top. It turned out that several high-ranking government officials had been involved in shady dealings, using their positions of power to embezzle funds and launder money. The Banco Central burglary, it seemed, was just one part of a much larger operation, designed to funnel money out of the country and into the pockets of these corrupt officials. But that wasn't the most shocking revelation. As the police dug deeper, they found evidence that suggested the corruption went even further, that there were international players involved, and that the Banco Central burglary was just a small part of a global money laundering scheme. The investigation was now a full-blown international affair, with authorities from several countries working together to unravel the threads of the conspiracy. The stakes were high, and the police knew that they were taking a huge risk by pursuing this lead. But they also knew that they had no choice, that they had to see this through to the end, no matter where it would take them. And so, they pressed on, following the trail of evidence, no matter how complex or convoluted it might be. The Banco Central burglary had started as a simple heist, but it had evolved into something much bigger, a massive conspiracy that threatened to destabilize the entire Brazilian economy. As the police worked to unravel the mystery, they couldn't help but wonder what other secrets lay hidden beneath the surface. The Banco Central burglary had been a wake-up call, a reminder that even in the most secure systems, there are always vulnerabilities, always weaknesses that can be exploited. But it had also shown them that with determination and perseverance, even the most complex crimes can be solved. The investigation was far from over, but one thing was clear. The police would not rest until they had brought the perpetrators to justice and had uncovered the truth behind the Banco Central burglary. The case was now a sensation, with the media following every twist and turn. The public was fascinated by the complexity of the heist and the brazen nature of the thieves. But as the police worked to solve the case, they knew that they had to be careful. They were dealing with powerful forces that would stop at nothing to keep their secrets safe. The police had to be careful not to get too close to the truth, or they might find themselves in the crosshairs. But they also knew that they couldn't back down, that they had to see this through to the end. As the investigation continued, the police began to notice a strange pattern. Several of the suspects they had arrested had ties to a particular law firm, a firm that specialized in money laundering and tax evasion. The police couldn't understand why this firm was involved, but they knew that they had to look closer. And then, they made a shocking discovery. The law firm was not just any law firm. It was a firm that had ties to the highest levels of government, a firm that had been used to launder money and funnel funds to corrupt officials. The police were now dealing with a conspiracy of epic proportions, a conspiracy that went all the way to the top. They knew that they had to be careful, that they were taking a huge risk by pursuing this lead. But they also knew that they had no choice, that they had to see this through to the end. The Banco Central burglary had started as a simple heist, but it had evolved into something much bigger, a massive conspiracy that threatened to destabilize the entire Brazilian economy. And the police were determined to get to the bottom of it, no matter what it took. The investigation was now a high-stakes game, with the police working to unravel the threads of the conspiracy. They were following a trail of evidence that led from the streets of Fortaleza to the highest levels of government. And as they worked to solve the case, they knew that they were in for a wild ride. The Banco Central burglary had been a wake-up call, a reminder that even in the most secure systems, there are always vulnerabilities, always weaknesses that can be exploited. But it had also shown them that with determination and perseverance, even the most complex crimes can be solved. The police were determined to see this through to the end, to bring the perpetrators to justice, and to uncover the truth behind the Banco Central burglary. As the investigation unfolded, detectives began to scrutinize the Banco Central's security protocols, searching for any clues that might explain how the thieves managed to breach the vault. They discovered that the bank's alarm system had been disabled, not just for the vault, but for the entire building, allowing the thieves to move undetected. But what raised more questions was the fact that the security cameras, which were supposed to be monitored 24/7, had been switched off, and the footage from the previous night was mysteriously missing. This wasn't just a simple case of a security lapse, it seemed like an inside job. But that wasn't the strangest part. The police started to interview the bank's employees, trying to identify any potential suspects or accomplices. They discovered that several employees had been acting suspiciously in the days leading up to the heist, accessing areas of the bank they weren't authorized to enter. One employee in particular caught their attention, a maintenance worker who had been hired just a few months prior to the heist. He had been tasked with performing routine maintenance on the bank's security systems, and it seemed he had been using his access to gather information and plan the heist. But as the police dug deeper, they found that this worker had a spotless record, and his colleagues described him as friendly and unassuming. It didn't add up. As the investigation continued, the police uncovered a web of contradictions and inconsistencies. The thieves seemed to have an intimate knowledge of the bank's layout and security systems, but they had also made some surprising mistakes. For example, they had left behind a trail of evidence, including fingerprints and DNA samples, which seemed almost intentional. It was as if they wanted to leave a trail, but not too obvious of one. The police were baffled. Were these thieves masterminds or amateurs? The more they learned, the more questions they had. But then, they received a cryptic message from an anonymous source, claiming to have information about the heist. The message was vague, but it hinted at a larger conspiracy involving corrupt government officials and organized crime syndicates. The police were skeptical, but they couldn't ignore the possibility that there was more to this heist than met the eye. They started to investigate the bank's connections to the government and organized crime, and what they found was disturbing. It turned out that the bank had been involved in several shady dealings, including money laundering and embezzlement. The thieves may have been after more than just cash. They may have been trying to expose the bank's dirty secrets. But that raised even more questions: who were these thieves, and what was their true motive? The police were now dealing with a complex case that went far beyond a simple burglary. As the investigation deepened, the police encountered more complications. They discovered that the bank's vault was not just a secure storage facility, but also a repository for sensitive documents and records. The thieves may have been after these documents, which could have embarrassing implications for the government and the bank. The police were now dealing with a potential scandal that could reach the highest levels of power. But then, they received another message from the anonymous source, claiming that the documents were just the tip of the iceberg. The source hinted at a massive cover-up involving some of the most powerful people in the country. The police were now faced with a daunting task to uncover the truth behind the Banco Central burglary and to bring the perpetrators to justice, no matter how high up the chain of command they went. The investigation was now a high-stakes game, with the police racing against time to uncover the truth before it was too late. They were dealing with a complex web of corruption, deceit, and conspiracy, and they knew that one wrong move could have disastrous consequences. The police were under immense pressure to solve the case, but they were also driven by a sense of justice and a determination to expose the truth. As they delved deeper into the case, they encountered more twists and turns, each one leading them further down the rabbit hole. But they refused to give up, driven by a fierce determination to uncover the truth behind the Banco Central burglary. The police discovered that the thieves had used sophisticated tools and equipment to breach the vault, including high-tech drills and cutting-edge lock-picking devices. But what was even more surprising was that these tools were not available on the black market. They were custom-made, suggesting that the thieves had access to significant resources and expertise. The police were now dealing with a highly organized and well-equipped group of thieves who seemed to have planned the heist with military precision. But then, they received a shocking revelation. One of the thieves had been identified as a former member of an elite special forces unit, with a background in covert operations. The police were now faced with a disturbing possibility that the thieves may have been trained by the government itself. As the investigation continued, the police encountered more contradictions and paradoxes. The thieves seemed to be a mix of amateurs and professionals, with some making rookie mistakes, while others demonstrated exceptional skill and expertise. The police were struggling to understand the dynamics of the group and how they had managed to work together to pull off the heist. But then, they discovered a surprising connection between the thieves. They all had one thing in common: a shared experience that had brought them together. It turned out that they had all been involved in a previous heist, one that had gone horribly wrong and had left them with a deep sense of betrayal and mistrust. The police were now dealing with a group of thieves who were not just motivated by greed, but also by a desire for revenge. The investigation was now a complex psychological game, with the police trying to understand the motivations and dynamics of the thieves. They were dealing with a group of individuals who were driven by a mix of emotions, including anger, resentment, and a sense of injustice. The police were now faced with a daunting task to unravel the tangled web of relationships and motivations that had led to the Banco Central burglary. But as they delved deeper into the case, they encountered more surprises and contradictions, each one leading them further into the unknown. The police were now on a journey into the heart of darkness, where nothing was as it seemed, and the truth was hidden behind a veil of deception and lies. As the police dug deeper, they discovered that the Banco Central burglary was just the tip of the iceberg. It was part of a larger pattern of corruption and deceit that went all the way to the top. The police were now dealing with a massive conspiracy that involved some of the most powerful people in the country. They were faced with a daunting task to expose the truth and bring the perpetrators to justice, no matter how high up the chain of command they went. The police were now in a high-stakes game where the outcome was far from certain. But they refused to give up, driven by a fierce determination to uncover the truth and to bring justice to the people. The Banco Central burglary was now a symbol of something much larger: a struggle for justice, transparency, and accountability. in a system that seemed to be rigged against the ordinary citizen. The investigation was now a marathon, not a sprint. The police were in for the long haul, and they knew that they would have to navigate a complex landscape of corruption, deceit, and conspiracy. But they were driven by a sense of purpose and a commitment to justice. They knew that they would have to overcome countless obstacles and challenges, but they were determined to see it through to the end. The Banco Central burglary was now a test of their resolve, their determination, and their commitment to justice. The police were now on a journey into the unknown, where the truth was hidden behind a veil of secrecy and deception. But they were ready for the challenge, armed with their skills, their experience, and their determination to uncover the truth. The outcome was far from certain, but one thing was clear: the police would stop at nothing to solve the case and bring the perpetrators to justice. As the police dug deeper, they began to unravel a web of complex tunnel systems and hidden passages that the thieves had used to gain access to the vault. The tunnel itself was a marvel of engineering, stretching over 250 feet from a nearby property to the bank's vault, and was equipped with lighting, ventilation, and even a rail system to transport the stolen cash. But what was even more astonishing was the fact that the tunnel had been dug over several months, with the thieves working tirelessly to avoid detection. The police were left wondering how such a massive operation could have gone unnoticed for so long, and whether there were any inside jobs or corruption that had facilitated the heist. The investigation led to a series of surprising revelations, including the discovery of a fake identity used by one of the suspected thieves. The identity, which included a fake name, address, and even a fake family, had been so meticulously created that it had fooled even the most seasoned detectives. But as the police delved deeper into the identity, they found a trail of inconsistencies and contradictions that raised more questions than answers. For instance, the fake identity had been used to rent a property near the bank, but the owner of the property claimed to have never met the person who had rented it. But that wasn't the strangest part, as the police soon discovered that the property had been rented through a real estate agent who had a history of shady dealings. As the police continued to follow the trail of clues, they encountered a cast of characters who seemed to be hiding something. There was the bank's security guard, who claimed to have seen nothing unusual on the night of the heist, but whose alibi didn't quite add up. Then, there was the bank's manager, who seemed overly nervous and agitated during the police interviews, and whose background check revealed a history of financial troubles. The police were beginning to suspect that there may have been more than one insider involved in the heist, but they still had no concrete evidence to prove it. The investigation was becoming increasingly complex, with new leads and new suspects emerging every day, and the police were struggling to keep up with the pace. One of the most significant breakthroughs in the case came when the police discovered a hidden camera that had been installed near the bank's vault. The camera had been cleverly disguised as a security device, but it had actually been used by the thieves to monitor the bank's security systems and plan their heist. The footage from the camera revealed a shocking level of sophistication and planning, and it became clear that the thieves had been watching the bank's every move for months. But what was even more alarming was the fact that the camera had been installed by a company that had been hired by the bank itself to provide security services. The police were left wondering whether the company had been compromised, or whether there was a mole within the bank who had facilitated the installation of the camera. The police were also investigating a series of suspicious transactions that had taken place in the months leading up to the heist. It appeared that large sums of money had been transferred into and out of the bank, using a complex network of shell companies and offshore accounts. The transactions seemed to be linked to a group of wealthy businessmen who had ties to the bank, and the police were suspecting that these individuals may have been involved in the heist. But as they dug deeper, they found that the transactions were just the tip of the iceberg, and that there was a much larger web of corruption and deceit that went all the way to the top. The police were beginning to realize that the Banco Central burglary was not just a simple heist, but a symptom of a much larger problem that threatened the very fabric of the Brazilian economy. As the investigation continued, the police encountered a series of obstacles and challenges that threatened to derail the entire case. There were rumors of corruption within the police department itself, and some officers were accused of being on the take. The police were also facing pressure from the government and the bank to solve the case quickly, which was adding to the tension and the stress. But despite these challenges, the police remained committed to solving the case, and they were driven by a sense of justice and a determination to bring the perpetrators to account. The outcome was still far from certain, but one thing was clear: the police would stop at nothing to uncover the truth, no matter how complex or how difficult it may be. The police were also exploring a possible link between the Banco Central burglary and a series of other high-profile heists that had taken place in Brazil in recent years. It seemed that the same group of thieves may have been responsible for these heists, and that they had been using the same modus operandi to carry out their crimes. The police were studying the evidence from these previous heists, looking for any clues or patterns that might lead them to the perpetrators. But as they delved deeper into the evidence, they found that each heist had its own unique characteristics, and that the thieves had been constantly adapting and evolving their tactics. The police were facing a moving target, and they had to be constantly on their toes to keep up with the thieves. The investigation was taking a toll on the police, both physically and emotionally. The officers were working long hours, often for days on end, and they were facing a tremendous amount of pressure to solve the case. The police were also dealing with the emotional fallout of the heist, as the victims of the crime were struggling to come to terms with their losses. The police were providing support and counseling to the victims, but it was clear that the impact of the heist would be felt for a long time to come. The police were determined to bring the perpetrators to justice, not just for the sake of the victims, but also to restore the public's faith in the banking system and the rule of law. As the police continued to investigate, they began to uncover a complex web of relationships and connections between the suspects and the bank. It seemed that some of the suspects had ties to the bank's employees, and that they may have had access to sensitive information about the bank's security systems. The police were also looking into the bank's internal controls to see if there were any weaknesses or vulnerabilities that the thieves may have exploited. The investigation was becoming increasingly complex, with new leads and new suspects emerging every day, and the police were struggling to keep up with the pace. But they were driven by a sense of justice and a determination to uncover the truth, no matter how complex or how difficult it may be. The police were also exploring a possible link between the Banco Central burglary and a series of other crimes that had taken place in Brazil, including money laundering and corruption. It seemed that the thieves may have been using the stolen cash to fund other illicit activities, and that they may have had ties to organized crime groups. The police were working with other law enforcement agencies to investigate these links and to see if they could uncover a larger conspiracy. The investigation was taking on a new level of complexity as the police delved into the world of organized crime and corruption. But they were undaunted, and they were driven by a sense of justice and a determination to bring the perpetrators to account. As the investigation continued, the police were faced with a series of challenges and obstacles that threatened to derail the case. There were rumors of corruption and deceit, and some officers were accused of being on the take. The police were also facing pressure from the government and the bank to solve the case quickly, which was adding to the tension and the stress. But despite these challenges, the police remained committed to solving the case, and they were driven by a sense of justice and a determination to uncover the truth. The outcome was still far from certain, but one thing was clear: the police would stop at nothing to bring the perpetrators to justice, no matter how complex or how difficult it may be. But that wasn't the only challenge they were facing, as they were about to discover a new twist that would change the course of the investigation forever. As the investigation unfolded, detectives began to scrutinize the bank's security measures, searching for any vulnerabilities that the thieves might have exploited. They discovered that the Banco Central had recently upgraded its security system, including the installation of motion detectors and video cameras. However, upon closer inspection, it became apparent that the thieves had managed to disable these devices, raising questions about the level of sophistication and inside knowledge they possessed. But that wasn't the only discrepancy, as further analysis revealed that the bank's alarms had not been triggered during the break-in, suggesting a level of familiarity with the security protocols that went beyond mere coincidence. The police were now faced with the daunting task of identifying potential suspects, a challenge compounded by the fact that the thieves had left behind no discernible evidence, no fingerprints, no DNA, and no witnesses who could provide a credible description. The only lead they had was a cryptic message left behind by the thieves, taunting the authorities and claiming responsibility for the heist. But as investigators delved deeper into the case, they began to notice inconsistencies in the message, which seemed to suggest that the thieves were not just common criminals, but rather a group with a specific agenda and a deep understanding of the bank's inner workings. The question on everyone's mind was, what could be the motive behind such a daring and intricate crime? As the investigation continued to unfold, detectives started to interview bank employees and former staff members, searching for anyone who might have had access to sensitive information or a grudge against the institution. It was during one of these interviews that they stumbled upon a surprising revelation. Several employees had reported experiencing strange occurrences in the months leading up to the heist, including unexplained noises and movements in the bank's vault area. But that wasn't the strangest part, as one employee came forward with a claim that she had seen a group of men in suits, who were not bank employees, walking around the vault area late at night, just days before the burglary. The employee's testimony raised more questions than answers, and the police were now faced with the possibility that the thieves might have had inside help. The police were now tasked with the difficult job of verifying the employee's claim, which would require them to scrutinize the bank's access logs and security footage. As they pored over the evidence, they discovered a discrepancy in the bank's visitor logs, which seemed to suggest that the group of men in suits had indeed been in the bank, but their presence had not been recorded. The discovery sparked a heated debate among investigators, with some arguing that the employee's testimony was credible, while others believed it was just a case of mistaken identity. But as they continued to investigate, they stumbled upon another surprising revelation. The bank's head of security had recently been fired, and the reason for his termination was shrouded in mystery. The police decided to pay a visit to the former head of security, hoping to shed some light on the circumstances surrounding his departure. What they found was a man who was hesitant to talk, but eventually opened up about the pressure he had faced from the bank's management to downplay the severity of the security breaches. He revealed that the bank had been experiencing a series of small-scale thefts and security incidents in the months leading up to the heist, but these had been swept under the rug to avoid attracting unwanted attention. The former head of security's testimony painted a picture of a bank that was more concerned with its public image than with addressing the serious security vulnerabilities that existed. But that wasn't the only bombshell he dropped, as he also revealed that he had been approached by a mysterious individual who had offered to help him improve the bank's security, just weeks before the heist. The police were now faced with the daunting task of identifying the mysterious individual and determining their role in the heist. As they dug deeper, they discovered that the individual was a former security consultant who had worked with several high-profile clients in the past. But what caught their attention was the fact that this consultant had also worked with the Brazilian government on several high-stakes security projects. The question on everyone's mind was, could this individual have had the resources and expertise to pull off such a daring heist? The police decided to bring the consultant in for questioning, hoping to get to the bottom of their involvement in the case. As the consultant sat down for the interview, the police noticed that they seemed nervous and agitated, glancing over their shoulder as if they feared being watched. The consultant's demeanor only added to the mystery, and the police were determined to get to the truth. But just as the interview was about to begin, the consultant's lawyer intervened, citing concerns about the police's methods and the potential for entrapment. The sudden interruption raised more questions than answers, and the police were now faced with the possibility that the consultant might be more involved than they initially thought. But that wasn't the only twist, as the lawyer revealed that the consultant had been working with a rival bank, which had been trying to acquire the Banco Central for months. The police were now tasked with the difficult job of unraveling the complex web of relationships between the bank, the consultant, and the rival bank. As they delved deeper into the case, they discovered a pattern of aggressive business tactics and espionage, which seemed to suggest that the heist was just the tip of the iceberg. The question on everyone's mind was, could the rival bank have been involved in the heist? And if so, what was their motive? The police decided to pay a visit to the rival bank's CEO, hoping to get some answers. But as they arrived at the bank's headquarters, they were met with a surprise. The CEO was nowhere to be found, and the bank staff seemed reluctant to talk. The police were now faced with the daunting task of tracking down the CEO, who seemed to have vanished into thin air. As they searched for leads, they stumbled upon a cryptic message on the bank's website, which seemed to suggest that the CEO was still in control, but operating from the shadows. The message only added to the mystery, and the police were determined to get to the bottom of the case. But as they continued to investigate, they realized that the heist was just one part of a larger puzzle, a puzzle that involved corruption, greed, and a complex web of relationships that went all the way to the top. The question on everyone's mind was, how far did the corruption go, and who was behind it all? The police were now tasked with the difficult job of unraveling the truth and bringing those responsible to justice. As the investigation continued to unfold, the police discovered that the Banco Central heist was not an isolated incident, but rather part of a larger pattern of corruption and crime that had been plaguing the Brazilian economy for years. The heist had simply been the most brazen and daring example of this corruption, and the police were now determined to expose the truth and bring those responsible to justice. But as they delved deeper into the case, they realized that the corruption went all the way to the top, and that the heist was just one part of a larger conspiracy. The question on everyone's mind was, how far would the police be able to go in their pursuit of justice, and would they be able to bring those responsible to account for their actions? The police were now faced with the daunting task of navigating the complex web of relationships and corruption that had led to the heist. As they continued to investigate, they discovered that the corruption was not just limited to the banking sector, but had also infected other areas of the economy. The heist had simply been a symptom of a larger disease, and the police were now determined to find the cure. But as they dug deeper, they realized that the corruption was so entrenched that it would be difficult to root out, and that the heist was just one part of a larger problem. The question on everyone's mind was, could the police and the authorities overcome the corruption and bring those responsible to justice? Or would the heist remain just another example of the endemic corruption that had come to characterize the Brazilian economy? As the investigation continued to unfold, the police discovered that the Banco Central heist was not just a crime, but a symptom of a larger problem that had been plaguing the Brazilian economy for years. The heist had simply been the most brazen and daring example of this problem, and the police were now determined to expose the truth and bring those responsible to justice. But as they delved deeper into the case, they realized that the problem was so complex and multifaceted that it would be difficult to solve, and that the heist was just one part of a larger puzzle. The question on everyone's mind was, could the police and the authorities overcome the corruption and bring those responsible to justice? Or would the heist remain just another example of the endemic corruption that had come to characterize the Brazilian economy? The police were now tasked with the difficult job of unraveling the truth and bringing those responsible to account for their actions. The investigation into the Banco Central heist was a complex and challenging case, with many twists and turns. As the police continued to dig deeper, they discovered that the heist was not just a crime, but a symptom of a larger problem that had been plaguing the Brazilian economy for years. The heist had simply been the most brazen and daring example of this problem, and the police were now determined to expose the truth and bring those responsible to justice. But as they delved deeper into the case, they realized that the problem was so complex and multifaceted that it would be difficult to solve, and that the heist was just one part of a larger puzzle. The question on everyone's mind was, could the police and the authorities overcome the corruption and bring those responsible to justice? Or would the heist remain just another example of the endemic corruption that had come to characterize the Brazilian economy? Only time would tell, as the police continued to investigate and uncover the truth behind the Banco Central heist. As the investigation into the Banco Central heist continued, the authorities began to uncover a complex web of characters and motives, each one more intriguing than the last. It became clear that the heist was not just a simple case of theft, but rather a sophisticated operation that involved insiders, outsiders, and possibly even elements of organized crime. The police were faced with the daunting task of separating fact from fiction, as the suspects and witnesses seemed to be hiding behind a veil of secrecy and deception. But that wasn't the strangest part, for as they dug deeper, they discovered that the heist may have been just the tip of the iceberg, a symptom of a larger disease that had been plaguing the Brazilian economy for years. The more the police learned, the more they realized that the Banco Central heist was not an isolated incident, but rather part of a larger pattern of corruption and embezzlement that had been going on for decades. They found evidence of money laundering, bribery, and kickbacks, all of which seemed to be linked to a small group of powerful individuals who had infiltrated the highest levels of government and finance. The authorities were shocked to discover that some of these individuals had even been involved in previous scandals, but had managed to escape prosecution due to their connections and influence. This raised serious questions about the effectiveness of the justice system and the ability of the government to root out corruption. But what was even more disturbing was the possibility that the heist may have been used as a smokescreen to cover up an even larger crime, one that could have far-reaching consequences for the entire country. As the investigation continued, the police began to focus on a small group of suspects, each with their own unique motives and connections to the heist. There was the former bank employee who had been fired 6 months prior to the heist and who had been struggling to make ends meet. There was the businessman who had been involved in several shady deals in the past and who had a reputation for being ruthless and cunning. And then there was the mysterious figure who seemed to be pulling the strings from behind the scenes, a figure who had been linked to several other high-profile crimes in the past. But despite the progress they were making, the police were still faced with a major obstacle: the lack of concrete evidence. They had plenty of circumstantial evidence and plenty of suspects, but they still needed that one piece of evidence that would tie everything together. And that's when they received a cryptic message from an anonymous source claiming to have information about the heist. But could they trust this source, or was it just another wild goose chase? The message read like a puzzle, with cryptic clues and references to events that had taken place years ago. But one thing was clear: the source was claiming to have evidence of a massive cover-up, one that went all the way to the top of the government. The police were skeptical at first, but as they began to investigate the claims, they realized that there may be some truth to them. They discovered that several high-ranking officials had been involved in shady dealings, and that they had been using their positions to cover up their tracks. But the more they learned, the more they realized that the truth was far more complex than they had ever imagined. The heist was not just a simple crime, but rather a symptom of a larger disease that had been festering for years. And at the heart of it all was a web of corruption and deceit that seemed to be endless. But what was even more disturbing was the possibility that the heist may have been just the beginning, a test run for an even larger operation that could have catastrophic consequences for the entire country. As the police continued to investigate, they began to uncover a trail of evidence that led them deeper and deeper into the heart of the Brazilian economy. They discovered that the heist was not just a one-time event, but rather part of a larger pattern of corruption and embezzlement that had been going on for decades. They found evidence of money laundering, bribery, and kickbacks, all of which seemed to be linked to a small group of powerful individuals who had infiltrated the highest levels of government and finance. But the more they learned, the more they realized that the truth was far more complex than they had ever imagined. The heist was not just a simple crime, but rather a symptom of a larger disease that had been festering for years. And at the heart of it all was a web of corruption and deceit that seemed to be endless. The police were faced with a daunting task: to untangle the web of corruption and bring those responsible to justice. But as they delved deeper into the case, they realized that the stakes were much higher than they had ever imagined. The heist was not just a crime, but a threat to the very stability of the Brazilian economy. And the question on everyone's mind was, what would happen next? The investigation was taking a toll on the police, who were working around the clock to uncover the truth. They were faced with countless dead ends, false leads, and disappointments, but they refused to give up. They were driven by a sense of justice and a determination to bring those responsible to account. But as they delved deeper into the case, they began to realize that the truth was far more complex than they had ever imagined. The heist was not just a simple crime, but rather a symptom of a larger disease that had been festering for years. And at the heart of it all was a web of corruption and deceit that seemed to be endless. The police were getting close to the truth, but they knew that they still had a long way to go. They were navigating a complex landscape of corruption and deceit.